Shade the Changing Man by Peter Milligan is a reinterpretation of the short-lived Ditko series from the 1970s. For the record, during the 1980s, Shade did have a recurring role in the Suicide Squad, but the character was written out of that series, presumably, to make room for this new, ongoing series. Some elements of the Ditko series were retained, such as the red-headed character, Rack Shade, his strained relationship with the woman Melu on his home planet, Meta, the area of madness between Earth and Meta, and Shade wearing a vest that facilitates his power. Milligan would incorporate these details and take them in his own unique direction. As for the series itself, it can be broken into 3 distinct parts: The American Scream, Hotel Shade, and Everything After. The first 18 issues are one ongoing story known as The American Scream. It establishes why Shade has been sent to Earth and the mission he's supposed to accomplish. It pays lip service to being an oddball superhero comic, but it's actually a pointed critique of American culture and how it affects the world. Milligan hits all the thematic topics one might expect: capital punishment, the Kennedy assassination, the Hollywood movie machine, the homeless population, the sold-out hippie generation, and the facade of normalcy. All of this builds to a final confrontation with the personification of the American Scream, who is the skeletal remains of the iconic figure Uncle Sam. Milligan accurately identifies the point when this influence, or madness if you will, began to directly infect everyone around it, and that would be the untimely end of the president, John F. Kennedy. Not so much the act itself, but the circumstances that branched out after that president was publicly executed. It produced a perceptible existential shock, a cultural instability, and multiple explanations as to how and why this event took place. Regardless of the official report or vast amounts of alternate theories, it was something that defied rationality. It became the infection that would spread and proliferate. The head of Kennedy being a sphinx who asks a riddle that is enigmatic and has no obvious answer was a perfect metaphor. It contains the intellectual confusion and the multiple conclusions that are available, all of which have some validity, but only one is the correct answer that satisfies the Sphinx question. As for the mission itself, Shade is there to eradicate the madness infecting America and prevent it from spreading to his planet, Meta. So Shade personifies the concerns of the world about a country that has a rampant negative influence over other countries. At the same time, this madness gives him power, so it's an interesting juxtaposition of using what's perceived as evil in an attempt to do good. Broadly speaking, one could argue that madness itself, while irrational and chaotic, can be used as a positive force for change. That theme underlies the series as a whole, and it's widely open for interpretation. This portion of the series has the most appeal for a general audience. While surreal in places, it is cohesive and focused on one goal. Much like Milligan's future series, The Ecstatics, it's an interesting take on the superhero genre, with its own unique flavor and sensibilities. However, after this, it changes direction. The series wanders slightly at this point, but only slightly. Shade discovers a personality within him known as Hades. At times they swap places, and Hades assumes control of their shared body. During one such swap, Hades is killed by Stringer, a double agent who works for the CIA and an organization on Meta. When Shade returns to control his body, he is unaware that he's been killed. This lack of knowledge and his connection to the area of madness allows him to continue to exist. But he will certainly die soon if he doesn't possess another body. Here's where the series becomes a bit convoluted, and the series completely moves past its tentative superhero roots. While the Vertigo Comics imprint didn't exist yet, Shade becomes an example of what I think of as a standard early Vertigo title. The narrative becomes less straightforward, and it's more about mood, atmosphere, and sometimes too much poetic language. I think of it as intellectual psychedelia, words as drugs rather than exposition, and the plot is less important than the circumstances that occur around it. This approach is easily justifiable for a series like Shade, and somewhat appropriate. This transition period takes place over a number of issues, which allows the reader to settle into this new direction. Back to the plot. After discovering the reason for his death, Shade now has to find a suitable body to inhabit. This leads him to occupy a recently deceased woman. Shade struggles to maintain control of this new form and, at times, finds himself displaying both male and female characteristics. It's not until he uncovers the murder mystery that led to the woman's death that he's finally able to assume the male shape he identifies with. It's also revealed that during the time he let go of his previous body and entered a new one, angels stole a piece of Shade's soul. They used this stolen piece to blackmail Shade into following their commands. The angels direct Shade and company to a hotel, where he remains until he fulfills the angels' mission. That mission is to kill a child, so the angels can place a divine being inside it. Naturally, Shade is fairly uncomfortable with that plan. After some odd adventures and a few identity issues, Shade gets Kathy pregnant, and the angels turn their attention to that unborn child. They order Shade to sacrifice his own child once it's born. Out of options, and needing to become whole again, Shade makes a literal deal with the devil. The devil, who looks like the figurehead of the Church of the Subgenius, Bob Dodds, agrees to eliminate the angels if Shade releases him from captivity. Once freed, the devil holds up his end of the bargain, but not before Kathy is killed. The baby is born, but it has been influenced by the devil in the same manner the angels intended. Angered by this interference and Kathy's death, Shade abandons this child and seeks revenge on the devil. Apparently, Milligan intended to end the series with the 50th issue, but he was convinced by his editor to remain and continue. While I couldn't find anything to confirm this, the majority of that issue does read like the saga was wrapping up. With the exception of the final pages, it could have come to an appropriate, bittersweet conclusion. Instead, the series becomes something different once again. Summarizing the forthcoming events is slightly difficult due to the surreal nature of what follows. It becomes outright untethered and conceptual. It fully leans into madness. To begin with, Shade takes care of the lingering plot threads involving the devil and the angels. In the process, he discovers he cannot die. To indicate how surreal the series becomes, Shade takes up residence in a crack in the pavement in Times Square. It's basically its own reality, with its own set of rules. Although what rules might exist are never made explicit. It's almost as if he creates his own personalized area of madness to live within. For a while, Shade becomes a dance floor. A duplicate that forms itself from his skin flakes follows him around. The people closest to him find themselves trapped in their own separate worlds. Shade discovers his heart is missing, and when it tries to return, he literally locks it away, so he can experience life without a conscience. He then engages in a variety of questionable activities with little regard for those around him. Before the series winds down, Shade is a self-serving, completely sociopathic individual. When the final storyline begins, Shade seems to be an unredeemable, pale version of himself. The final 3 issues involve Shade literally undoing all the events that led to Kathy's death. In the process, Shade loses the power of madness, and he becomes as human as he's ever going to be. Everyone in the supporting cast is also given the chance to have their own appropriate level of closure. The series ends with Shade approaching Kathy, who knows nothing about him, trying to become a part of her life again. It's both sweet and heartbreaking, and perfectly captures the unknowable future of 2 people finding one another and beginning a relationship. In my opinion, soon after wrapping up the plot threads from issue 50, Milligan intended to turn Shade into a highly unlikable villain and see the results. Perhaps it was a subconscious effort to make the readers feel completely estranged. Then, if sales reflected that estrangement, Milligan would have the opportunity to conclude the series on his own terms. Admittedly, that's a wild conspiracy theory on my part. It's slightly supported by the fact that it suddenly established that Shade cannot die. No matter what he does, Shade will continue on, just like every comic book property in an ongoing series. It's like Milligan is silently lamenting the fact that he's continuing the series beyond the endpoint he intended. Possibly, because sales were still solid at issue 50, DC wouldn't let the series end, and they would have replaced Milligan if he stepped aside. In order for the series to end on his terms, without another writer coming in and possibly ruining what he built, Milligan needed to devalue the character to a point where DC had no choice but to let the series conclude. Thus, the direction of the series changes after issue 53, when the Angel and Devil story is resolved, and Shade moves into a crack, or niche if you will, to contemplate life after Kathy. To elaborate further, Shade's heart going missing is far too obvious of a metaphor to justify Shade's bad behavior. Milligan is usually more subtle than that. I would argue it was actually a metaphor concerning the series itself. Specifically, the death of Kathy removed a vital part of the series. Without her, it had lost its heart and lacked a soul. It only kept going because Milligan felt an obligation to continue. In this state, Shade, the character, literally attacks the entire supporting cast, which represents Milligan tearing down the foundation he established without being too obvious about it. Even the issue title suggests disdain or regret. Grotesquerie, rotten pot, lips of quiddity. Quiddity means the essence of something. Heart attacks, dead bodies. Taken together, it suggests the essence of the series has become rotten. Its heart has stopped working, and it's in a state of decay. Again, this is the impression I got based on the nature of the material. Milligan has stated nothing on the record to suggest this occurred. Mind you, no reasonable writer is going to admit they intentionally tanked a series. That's an admission that would ruin their career. But personally, I think the deftly coded signs are there. The majority of the series was illustrated by Chris Bachalo. In the beginning, his skills are still developing. There's a lot of confidence in what he does, but he hasn't reached a fully formed state. Much like the series itself, you have an artist that is in the process of change, finding a style through trial and error, and coming alive on the page. It's something that helps the atmosphere of the series, especially in the early years when Shade is struggling to define himself. It's a rare occasion where the evolution of the artist reflects the development of the main character. It's not a perfect one-to-one ratio, where Bachalo's skills and Shade's capabilities develop in tandem, but there are enough similarities to make that comparison. The other artists that filled in or followed Bachalo were all competent, but lacked the visual flair to fully enhance Milligan's writing. Although Colleen Doran's work on issues 27 through 29 was very suitable for the story. Mark Buckingham did come the closest to capturing the earlier stylistic flavor, but unfortunately, he didn't stay on the title for long. The series even included early Michael Lark and Sean Phillips' work, but their styles weren't ideal. In fact, Shade had a number of artists until late into the series, when former Doom Patrol artist Richard Case stepped in to bring the series to a close. Shade mostly plays with identity, or more accurately, how one chooses to identify themselves. Identity itself is a broad topic, which includes gender and sexuality, along with personality and how one desires to be perceived by others. For most people, there is a baseline identity, and it shifts and transforms or hardens over time. Some characteristics are heightened, while others become subtle or non-existent. As for the character Shade, he is, as the title suggests, changeable. His identity is always in flux and dependent on the circumstances directly affecting him. However, he is somewhat consistent in some areas. He is passionate and easy to anger. He is overly poetic and seems inspired by events that defy rationality. He's also unsure of himself and doesn't appear to have any long-term goals. When he is given a purpose, he resists it. When he finds a purpose on his own, it is highly self-centered and at the expense of those around him. It's not until the end that he finds something resembling a balance and becomes his own person. In many ways, the comic exemplifies how individual readers identify with the story itself. Let me explain. While researching this topic and looking for Milligan interviews, I stumbled across a few interpretations of the overall series. Putting aside the ones that were utterly erroneous, and an example of someone briefly skimming Wikipedia, I found myself disagreeing with the foundation of many arguments. At the same time, those interpretations weren't necessarily wrong. They were simply too narrow and focused on a specific narrative. From what I experienced, focusing on one narrative element ignores the overall exploration of identity itself. Yes, there is a love triangle, but love is not the overall theme. Yes, briefly, Shade becomes a woman, and Lenny and Kathy have an ongoing physical relationship, but it's not all about trans or queer issues. Shade goes from someone trying to maintain his sanity to embracing and reveling in madness, but it's not all about conforming to sociological norms and expectations. Now, I don't want to diminish the positive LGBTQ+ representation, or the deconstruction of what is perceived as standardized normalcy, because that does run through the series. What I am saying is these elements relate to the broader topic of identity. I did find it interesting that other interpretations were narrowed down, and presumably, the areas of the story the reader were engaged with on a more personal level. Ultimately, this is a strength to the series overall. It changes with the reader. If you put nothing into it, you get nothing out of it. And what you put into it changes what you get out of it. Certainly, this applies to fiction in general, but it seems intentionally baked into the personality of the series itself. Therefore, Shade is merely a container. It's filled with possibilities that allow for a variety of points one can identify with on a customized level. Perhaps, on another reread, my opinion might differ with the one within this video. I'd like to think that's a possibility. An unconventional love triangle develops between Kathy, Lenny, and Shade. In my opinion, the triangle is less about love and more about attraction, which isn't to suggest there isn't love, because there is, but it's their personalities that bring them all together. As a cheeky twist, Kathy suddenly becomes a blonde at one point, which perfectly alludes to the well-known classic love triangle in Archie comics. However, the focal point of this triangle isn't the male figure, it's the woman, Kathy. So, it plays with the normalized convention of a man in a position to choose between the affections of two women. In my opinion, Shade's love for Kathy is idealized more than realized. He loves the idea of being in love, but he's not very good at it. Physically, he's inept at meeting Kathy's needs. She has more fulfilling encounters with the personalities that take over Shade than with Shade himself. The final story highlights his idealized notion of love, and how he thinks he needs to be a particular way to be worthy of Kathy's affections. It's not until the very end, when he's lost everything, made some questionable choices, and he's on an equal, imperfect level as Kathy, that she fully accepts Shade into her life. It may turn out to be an ideal ending, or it may go terribly wrong, but whatever the result, it will be human. With Lenny, Kathy seems content in their relationship, but Lenny is freewheeling and resistant to any form of tangible commitment. Certainly, Lenny feels affection for Kathy, but Lenny is also pretty open to whatever comes her way. So for emotional depth, she's kind of shallow and seems willing to go in whatever direction is available, so to speak. Kathy is, for a significant amount of time, quite messed up. After the murder of her parents, she becomes a bag of trauma, drowning in liquor and avoidance. But I don't want to suggest her state of mind is such that being the person in the middle of a triangle is a bad choice. In fact, I would suggest the opposite. Lenny and Shade fulfill two different roles that provide her the support to heal. Regardless, this triangle seems to be a positive depiction of bisexuality, or possibly sexual fluidity. Actually, I would refine it even further. When these depictions arise, they are instantly accepted and normalized. By that I mean, there's not a lot of discussion around the implications of Lenny and Kathy being lovers. Certainly their involvement is initially kept secret, not because it's taboo, but because of the emotional impact it would have on Shade. After it's revealed, they accept, in principle, they're all in a polyamorous relationship. Despite being as thorough as possible, there are a lot of areas left unexamined. Lenny having a child would be an example, or the various side characters that appear during the final portion of the series, or how meta and the area of madness are plot devices that change over time. There's also time travel. Along the same lines, the comic is often cited as being one of the first to positively represent a transgender character, which it does obliquely. It's not nearly as explicit as some may claim. Each portion of the saga has its own flavor, so to speak, and each part could do with a detailed examination. Possibly, if this video does very well and gets a few thousand likes, I might get into those details in a future video or 3. This will have to do as an examination of a series that doesn't get enough attention. For any outsider or anyone who feels marginalized, this may be a good series to read. In the end, Shade might not be as highly plotted and literate as Sandman, or as visceral and profane as Preacher, nor did it have the respect and tenacity of Hellblazer. But for the newly created Vertigo imprint, it was a solid, foundational title. Ultimately, it was a road trip starring 2 women and an alien, who did their best to find something they could identify with in a culture where they were displaced. Thank you for watching, or listening, whatever the case may be. Additional thanks to all my fine supporters on Patreon and YouTube. Please show support by subscribing, liking the video, and leaving a comment. If you'd like to go a step further, there's a link to my Patreon down below. Extra special thanks to Francis De La Cruz, John Nyux, Andrew Barton, Odin Ashcroft, Ruby St. Dennis, Phil Sagan, Corey Drew, Ellis Gregor, Alexa Zernish, Brian Deaton, Johnny Lim, and Matt Marino. You are all justified and ancient.